Okay. Right. Heart's up. I'd say my heart rate's probably up around 85. And it's funny, I've done interviews before, but this is anyway.
We haven't
Go
built
easy
it.
on me.
No, it's great. It's great. It'll be fine. I think it's quite good actually because I don't quite know where we're going with this conversation today. It was a bit, so it'll be like Bill's, I think, and that went fine. So
Yeah, it did. It was really good, actually.
but yeah, the other thing we'll do, Mike, if you don't mind, is we to preserve bandwidth, we'll kill our video cameras, our cameras.
Okay.
And so we can't see each other's faces when we're just like,
Yeah, and it is true actually because it makes it a bit less performative. We just
Yeah.
get on with our own stuff when we're writing things and looking at the screens and stuff. That's it. I think we're done. And Natalie's gone already.
Okay,
Oh,
I will. That's me gone too.
Thank you for joining us for this special episode, the first episode of the third season of the SEFI podcast, which coincides with SEFI 2023 at TU Dublin and to help celebrate 50 years of SEFI.
What can we learn from the transformation of a technical university from a local to global player in engineering education? In this episode, we'll discuss this with Professor Emeritus Mike Murphy from TU Dublin in Ireland.
Welcome to the European Engineering Educators podcast by SEFI, the European Society for Engineering Education. Our mission is to develop and improve engineering education and strengthen its image in society.
I'm Neil Cooke.
And I'm Natalie Wint. So, Neil, I think I still see myself as one of these young, sort of naive academics who's come into engineering education, and I see all these things I want changed, like in the curriculum, the culture, the structure, lots of things. And I also recognise that I'm quite impatient, and sometimes I lack sort of long-term future vision and strategic thinking.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested to hear about how Mike has sort of managed change in such a sort of complex system. What about you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's been some big changes in higher education since the turn of the century. And I think from a European perspective, Ireland's changed immensely. And some have said it's emblematic of sort of this globalised vision of engineering education because it's changed the most. So I think the work that Mike's done with his colleagues at TU Dublin will give us all some real valuable insights about the changes all universities are making.
Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Delighted to be here.
So Professor Emeritus Mike Murphy was president of SEFI from 2017 to 2019. He has over 20 years experience in a variety of senior management roles at TU Dublin in Ireland, after working in telecommunications for Bell Labs Research AT&T in the USA. He holds several engineering degrees from Stevens Institute, Dublin Institute of Technology and Trinity College. He was programme coordinator for the initiative that led to the successful establishment of TU Dublin, Ireland's first designated technological university. His management roles include Faculty Director of Engineering and Director and Dean of the College of Engineering. In 2022, he was appointed Interim National Coordinator for the EU-funded €40 million national initiative to transform teaching and learning across the technological university sector in Ireland. So, Mike, you transitioned from industry to academia. Can you share with us how this transition came about and what sort of motivated you to join the academic world?
So I suppose I probably need to start that question back when I did my undergraduate at what became Dublin Institute of Technology. I did that in Dublin and then had the opportunity to go to the United States to study for a master's degree. I loved it. I was at Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey, and after my master's stayed for a PhD. But after I finished the PhD, I was offered assistant professorship at Stevens, and I was delighted to take that. But about a year later, realized that, in fact, that academic life wasn't for me. So I went out into industry in telecoms. But I always stayed connected to Stevens, and I was adjunct professor through the 1990s. So when I came back to Ireland on an industry project, I had this kind of continual relationship with the academy, with in fact being an adjunct faculty member. So I left the company I was with, Belcor, and a very short time later, the role of Dean of Engineering in DIT was advertised. And when I took a kind of a careful look at the specification for what they were looking for, it seemed to me that I provided a really good balance of academic and industry, Irish plus international, and high-tech experience. So I thought I was a good match, but I wasn't really sure whether I belonged as an academic or, whether I would be a fish out of water. Mm-hmm. But I applied for the role and ended up in the role of dean. And I quickly learned whether, in fact, I was that fish out of water or not.
So, Mike, you've recently retired from TU Dublin, which is a new university formed in 2019 with the merger of 3 institutes of technology, the largest of which was Dublin Institute of Technology, which itself enjoys a long history dating back 130 years. The TUD has about 30,000 students, 3,500 staff. Can you tell us more about TUD and the technological university sector in Ireland?
Yes. So as you kind of hint at, the technological university sector is in fact the result of a strategic plan for higher education at policy or government level within Ireland. Up to the establishment of TU Dublin in January 2019, there were no technological universities. There were 7 universities, and they were essentially mirrored by 14 institutes of technology, with a very, very careful delineation of who could call themselves a university and then those who were not. And Dublin Institute of Technology always straddled that boundary because we had many attributes of a university, but at the same time, we had real characteristics of the Institute of Technology sector. We had sub-degree programs, if you like, or higher certificates. We had apprentice students, we still do, and we had 3-year programs as well as 4-year programs. But our research output would have been lower than what was expected of a university. So the government decided that there was an opportunity to transform the sector. And so it proposed the establishment of technical universities, or technological universities to be exact. So one of the really brilliant ideas from a government perspective was they wanted consolidation in higher education. So they made it a condition of applying to become a technological university that you had to merge with at least one other institute of technology. So in Dublin, there were a total of 4 institutes of technology, and we merged with 2 of the other 3, Blanchardstown Institute of Technology and Institute of Technology Tala. And so on the 1st of January 2019, those 3 institutes were dissolved and TU Dublin came into existence. And subsequently, I should say, we now have 4 other technological universities in Ireland, and there are only 2 remaining institutes of technology in Ireland. So the sector has been transformed, and it has been a success story.
And this has all happened in the last 5 to 10 years.
5 years, 5 years, yes. Interestingly, Neil, in 1997, Dublin Institute of Technology, DIT, applied to become a university under previous legislation. And the report on that application said that we were almost ready to be a university, but perhaps in another 5 years, we might be ready. So 1997 to 2019. So it took basically 20 years. And the government has been very good. It has recognized that funding, structural funding, needs to go to support the embedding and the firm establishment of the technological universities. And in fairness to them, most of them have also looked at the opportunity to transform what they were doing in terms of a greater focus on their regional remits, as well as a greater focus on trying to put the three legs under the stool of excellent teaching, applied research, and great engagement with industry and the local community.
Okay, so you talked about this massive transformation in the sector in Ireland, and clearly TU Dublin has gained a real international profile. And in this episode, Mike, we're going to focus on sort of this transformation in engineering education from serving kind of the local needs to becoming this global force. So before we start with your journey on this, what in your view are the key ingredients for a successful transformation?
So I would love to be able to say to you that I was a real student of change and change management and the likes of Cotter's 8 steps for successful change.
Yes.
But no, I wasn't. Any of the knowledge I have in terms of how change has been studied generally came after the fact.
Learn by doing.
Yeah, learn by doing, and make lots of mistakes in doing as well. But I was recruited directly in as a director of the Faculty of Engineering, essentially an executive dean. And the president of DIT at the time, in hiring me in as an industry hire, was basically recognizing that some of the changes that he wanted to see within the Faculty of Engineering really couldn't be initiated and driven internally, that it just wasn't happening internally. So he wanted an outside stimulus. So one of the things I would say with respect to change is you need to know why you're trying to change. Or my favorite question of all is, what problem are we trying to solve? And so if there is a consensus in terms of what we're trying to do, then that needs to be, it does need to be set as a vision. There's no question. And one of the things I think that I would say I probably was not as good at initially was continuing to sell the vision, particularly to the people that don't buy the vision. They don't want to change. They're comfortable with where they are.
So you didn't necessarily follow these change management models, but you've instinctively followed some of those steps.
Yeah, you create the burning platform, as it is said. Yes, I can remember one meeting that I had with my faculty executive, and my faculty executive would have been 5 heads of school. And I had come back from a SEFI conference, and this would have been in the early 2000s, maybe 2004 or something. Yeah. And I was trying to convince the heads of school of the need for curriculum and pedagogical change. And I had this light bulb moment. I looked around the room and I looked at myself, if you like, and I said, the problem here is that we're a bunch of middle-aged white men who've been educated in engineering in the 1970s. Yeah. And that's not where we are right now. We're in the new century. And so what do we not know about how engineers should be educated and the skills our faculty, our teaching staff need to have in order to be successful in that? And that was a light bulb moment for me, that realization. And that also meant that anytime I had the opportunity to try and bring somebody in to recruit a new teacher, academic, lecturer, or some other support post, I would try to bring somebody in from the outside in order to just open us up to a wider perspective on what we could be doing.
So, Mike, you mentioned about bringing in like different perspectives, but what did you see as the sort of strengths where you currently were, and maybe the challenges you faced as well? Like, where were you at?
So, the key strength and acknowledged externally was that we were an excellent teaching institution. We were essentially a professionally oriented faculty of engineering. So we were practice focused, and our lecturers, as a consequence, were excellent. There was a degree of complacency in a number of programs. This sense that because people are telling us our teaching is excellent, then it must be, and we don't have to do anything to change. But the other excellent dynamic I saw in DIT was care for students, which tended sometimes to be almost like a, as one head of school said to me, we have to mother our students, otherwise they won't learn. In other words, this sense of trying to make them eat their vegetables as opposed to letting them eat their vegetables, if that makes any sense. And I think also our reach out to and connection with industry and the professions in particular, and to some extent with the community, but not as strong in terms of community engagement, but industry and professional engagement, very strong. The flip side of that was, of course, one of our key limitations was a weakness in our top postgrad activity, and certainly a weakness in our research MPhil and PhD activity. So there were a couple of, and still remain, a couple of structural issues. In Ireland, academics are recruited on standardized scales, and in what was the Institute of Technology sector, and still is in the technological university sector, there is a fairly onerous contract that academics need to work to, in which they are expected to have 16 for a lecturer and 18 for an assistant lecturer contact hours with students each year. That's pretty much full-on contact with students that's expected. And it's very, very difficult to actually convince academics that you're looking for research output on top of that. But I have to say, I take my hat off to so many of the academics, and especially when I came on and I started to beat the drum for greater research output, so many people that we hired, so many people that were already there, took up, responded to that drumbeat and got engaged in ways that they knew how to do it. Now, if I could actually sow a thought here as well, as we started to try and increase our research output, because we had so many great teachers, they were able to start looking at, what were they doing that made their teaching effective? What could they do better? And so we started to get some of our existing faculty starting to go to conferences to look at how others were doing it, and starting to release conference papers on that activity. And that was kind of like an awakening that was serendipitous, because they probably weren't strong enough to do disciplinary-based research, but they could talk about how they were teaching it.
So, Mike, you talked about broadening this perspective of bringing new people into DIT, and you came into DIT as this industry hire, and then developed yourself as an academic, and began to sort of foster a culture of a sort of DIT reaching out through conferences and so on. So, could you give us a bit more sort of information on how you led that type of change?
Again, the question gets me to reflect on the path, and you're right. When I came in as Dean of Engineering in 2002, for me, part of what I needed to do was to validate myself as an academic. So I started attending SEFI and ASCE conferences, partly to understand more what it meant to be either an engineering faculty member or an engineering student in the new century. And so I found myself attending all the sessions. I was trying to listen to new initiatives and what people were discovering through their research. And I was coming back and probably driving my heads of school kind of crazy in terms of, should we be looking at PBL and, what about active learning? And, really trying to bring ideas back that were, if you like, point ideas based on what I was hearing. But what I also was realizing was that, that probably is not the most effective way the dean's office should be operating. And that what I really needed was to leverage, if you like, the strength of the faculty. So what I started trying to do was to get our heads of school to travel out, and more importantly, to get our faculty traveling out.
Yeah.
And so we slowly started to see more of our people engaging in principally the SEFI community. And I really think when I look back on 20 years, I think that's one of the neatest things for me to see. It's not so much that, for example, TU Dublin is now hosting the SEFI 2023 annual conference, but it's to see the number of people from TU Dublin that are engaged across SEFI. So that trying to evolve from being kind of an inward focused, insular institution into an open, comfortable, and confident technological university engaged in so many ways, I think has been it's been remarkable, and it's one of the things that I am really proud of.
Yeah, I mean, I started that question talking about your personal transformation, but it appears to me that you were responsible for personal transformations of lots of people. Could you perhaps describe how these people changed?
So let me perhaps, to begin an answer to that, give you an example. On one of my, I think it was an academic research trip to MIT, I met Larry Bucchiarelli, Professor Emeritus at MIT and a leading design engineer and researcher in EER person. And I invited Larry to spend a semester at DIT, and he accepted. So this probably would have been around about 2007. So Larry came in with all of the credentials, respect, experience from a career in MIT. And he spent a semester poking around, getting to know our folks and looking at the programs, how we taught, what we taught, etc.
Yeah.
And his report, if you like, and I say report because it wasn't a formal report, but his engagement and what he said to so many of our teaching focused faculty gave them the sense that what they were doing was, if you like, at a level not that different than what was going on at an undergraduate teaching level, was not that different than what was going on at MIT.
Wow.
And I believe that there was this subtle shift that people started to realize that there was external validation of what they were doing. And I followed up from that visit by Larry Bucchiarelli by starting to have annual Fulbright scholars visit us. And it was really successful. Cheryl Sorby, who was hugely influential, still engaged with SEFI and with TU Dublin, came. She became president of ASCE. Stephanie Farrell came and later became president of ASCE. And these were people who themselves were serious researchers in how engineering students learn, how people learn, and how we should educate them better. And their constant presence acted as an agent, acted as essentially below my office. I mean, this was that because of what they were doing on a day-to-day basis, engaging with faculty, getting people to, deciding to write papers with them, etc. It really, I think, was a stimulating environment and was the start of our transformation into focusing, or not so much focusing, but developing our EER capabilities.
So, Mike, you touched upon some of the sort of significant achievements during this time. Would you be able to speak more about some of the key milestones during this transformational period?
So one of the things when you say key milestones, Natalie, I go back to the fact that I did not have my Cotter 8-stage plan. But one of the things that I did from early on when I arrived, there was no strategic plan within the Faculty of Engineering. In fact, I don't think DIT even had a strategic plan back in 2002. So a detailed strategic plan, I thought, was probably not valuable. But what we instead agreed were 5 or 6 strategic milestones. And we put some objectives against those milestones, had it on a one-page chart, and tried to work to that each year. So that was one. But then how did we achieve them? One of the things I did, which turned out to be really a very, very successful initiative, was there had been a proposal across DIT for a post of head of learning development on a faculty basis. And I decided I was going to go with that and internally appointed a head of learning development. And that person was responsible for quality assurance of programs. So that gave me now greater visibility in terms of what was actually happening inside our engineering programs. But also they had a learning development role. And that meant that they had a remit to try and improve the way our faculty actually engaged in their teaching. And so over the years, that has become a very, very successful role, not just within the faculty, but also across the university. And people, for example, like Brian Bowe came into that role, and Brian kicked on in terms of our ability to conduct engineering education research as his academic strength, but also there was rigor in terms of our quality assurance. So that was the appointment of a head of learning development was really successful. I then appointed a head of research. Again, the goal there was to help researchers develop, but also to help researchers understand what grants they might apply for, better ways to write those grant proposals, who they might collaborate with. So head of research, head of learning and development. I talked about Fulbright scholars bringing in those outside change agents. They never knew they were outside change agents, but that's what they were, and they were really successful at it. Recruitment. I would say this to anyone. Every time you're in a position to recruit somebody new, focus on that very, very carefully. Think very hard about the type of person you want, the cultural attributes you're trying to bring in, the activities you're looking to stimulate, and recruit appropriately. Do not simply recruit somebody who is like the person who's just retired. And then in terms of EER, which is, again, from a SEFI perspective, I think one of our success stories, as we began to develop a larger community of people involved in engineering education research, we formed what we called CREATE, the Center for the Research. Now, the acronyms have changed in terms of, originally it was architecture. I think it's applied technology now. But CREATE was our mechanism to bring people together on a regular basis and to try and focus some of our research outputs in the EER space. Again, Brian Bowe, key person in that originally, but the likes of Una Began and others have been really dynamic change agents in there as well. So those would be some of the achievements that I would point to that have led to greater engagement and involvement with organizations like SEFI and the SEFI member universities.
So, Mike, a lot of these sort of changes you were speaking about are very internal, but I was just wondering how sort of external factors such as policy, accreditation, those types of things were influencing how you felt you had to change.
Yes. So, Natalie, one of the things is that at a dean level, you can't ignore the external forces that are shaping what you're doing or what you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, these external forces were positive and influential. So let's take accreditation. In Ireland, engineering accreditation is overseen by Engineers Ireland, or the professional body that accredits engineering and awards the title of Chartered Engineer. In fact, Engineers Ireland has one of the SEFI board members is the Director General of Engineers Ireland. Engineers Ireland has been really positive in evolving its accreditation criteria for engineering programs at the 2-year program, the 3-year program, 4-year program, and in fact with master's programs as well. So each time, not each time, but they would have their criteria, which they would update on a regular basis. And internally, then we needed to respond and through accreditation visits, demonstrate that we were meeting those criteria. And that is a really good way for, our programs and our program leaders to show that they're continuing to evolve their programs to meet the accreditation criteria. Engineers Ireland has gotten better at that, and not just in TU Dublin, but across Ireland, there are really, I think for the most part, programs are excellent in engineering as a consequence of the diligent work that Engineers Ireland has done. So a real force for change and good from an external perspective. But in addition, the government, through different incentives, also looked to try and encourage change in teaching and learning. They founded a National Centre for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning, who did studies and proposed position papers on what could be done. The government put out funding such as Strategic Investment Fund for universities to change. So there has been, I think, a consistent, but not necessarily a straitjacketed approach to trying to incentivize and encourage change within higher education. And then we would take that and focus it on change within engineering education within initially DIT and then TU Dublin. So those external forces were always there, and I think really were quite helpful. Sometimes the wheels of the cart can get stuck in the mud, and what you've got to do is just get them moving again. And if you can get them move, then you can keep the momentum going.
So, Mike, we talk about some of these external drivers for change, and we know Ireland has transformed to this knowledge-based economy with some of the biggest technology companies in the world headquartered in Dublin, the Googles and the Microsofts, which give more options for your graduates. So what was their influence on TUD and the changes that you were involved in?
At one level, the influx of high-tech companies into Dublin was a response to the government's initiative to continue to nurture and develop a high skills or a knowledge-based economy. Now, that said, at one point about a dozen years ago, DIT gave an honorary doctorate to the global CEO of Intel. And I was at that dinner, and the Minister for Industry at the time asked Craig Barrett, the CEO, what was the reason why Intel were in Ireland? And the answer was essentially low cost, low tax environment. But what keeps them here is, in fact, the attractiveness of Dublin and Ireland in terms of them getting the type of graduates they want to succeed. So all higher education in Ireland has responded to producing the types of graduates that industry wants. And we've been helped by Dublin being quite an attractive, and Ireland, by the way, because Dublin might have the Googles and the Microsofts, but we've also got medtech, we've got pharma, and so pharma might be congregated more down in the south of Ireland, and medtech is congregated more in the west of Ireland. But we have an environment that people also like to come and live in.
Okay, Mike, I'm going to switch gears here now, talk about some of the bumps in the road. So there's obviously some pain in this journey you've taken DIT on.
Yeah, the body has no memory for pain, does it, Neil? even though the brain can recall it. So I maybe the one example I would give is coming back to one of the major initiatives that I undertook was to restructure the Faculty of Engineering. And we went about it in an open and transparent way with a number of different proposals for restructuring at each stage getting and taking all feedback from all members of the faculty on board, and eventually coming up with a final proposal that we were ready to implement. And I have to say, surprising me considerably was to find out that having done all that, if you like, my peers and the president were not particularly happy with what we were proposing. And essentially, I have to say I was quite surprised that fellow deans felt that they knew more about my faculty and wanted to propose changes to our agreed internal structure, as did the president at the time, that some of the changes that we were proposing perhaps were not in line with what his view of the faculty or the College of Engineering and Built Environment was. So I actually had to spend time and effort trying to convince my peers and the president of what we had basically spent a year in internal dialogue discussion to propose. And then the actual implementation got delayed further when, and again, I don't have a problem with this, but when there were additional objections, but not to the structure that we were trying to imply, but because there were other initiatives that, for example, our union colleagues wanted to see implemented within DIT, and their ability to get those desired initiatives implemented, one of their ways was to actually delay their approval of the change structure until their initiatives were agreed. I mean, that's a standard political tool. I don't have a problem with it. The union did not have a problem with our structure, that we had answered every question that they had, but it delayed us probably again by about a year before we implemented. So you asked about those dark days. When we began to implement the structure, the world's economy had collapsed in 2010. So within engineering, we were looking to implement the structure and at the same time deal with a collapse in public funding. So it was a time when anybody that asked to retire early, anybody that asked to leave, anybody that asked to transfer to a different place within DIT, we said yes to. We simply needed to reduce our cost base, and our cost base was 75–80% people. And so we lost, I think, about 130 people in about a 2-year window. So I have to say, I cannot speak highly enough about the program leaders and the lecturers who managed to still deliver all of our programs at that time. The other thing that happened, which made it really difficult, was that our part-time numbers collapsed. We always had a very strong part-time upskilling cohort of students,
Mm.
and our apprentice numbers collapsed, but the number of full-time students grew.
Right.
So we actually, the profile of our student body changed, and our program leaders had to respond to that as well. So there were many days where I would be in my office at 7:30 in the morning, and I was leaving when the porters were locking the building down at 9:30 or something at night, and going home. The family was in bed. I'd eat the dinner in front of the TV, go to bed, wake up and do it all again. So those were probably, for me, some of the darker days, but we got through it. For the most part, our restructuring was a success, and I think the faculty, the college rather, kicked on from there and went on to, continue to grow.
So, Mike, you've spoken about some of the bumps in the road, but I was wondering if you could share some of the sort of key reflections of the benefits of the changes brought in during that time, but also about the lessons you learned in terms of sort of understanding both engineering education, but also leading change.
One of my clearest reflective kind of comments is that in a leadership position, you have to trust in people. Education fundamentally is a people business. So anyone in a leadership position has to nurture their staff, all of the staff. It's not just the academic high flyers, it's the admin staff, it's the technical staff in the labs. So every chance you get, you need to talk to staff. I tried to walk the corridors. I tried to get coffee with different people. I talked to students. You get a much better perspective on what's going on. But it all comes back to trusting your people. And one of the things that I realized is that every time I got home, I wanted to be able to look at myself in the mirror and to not have any regrets with how I treated people. That even though I might have had a disagreement, even though a particular person might be trying to stymie an initiative, that I was still going to treat those people with respect, because that was how I was going to live with myself. And that was going to be, if you like, that value that I tried to exhibit might be evident to others as well. I suppose one of the things I'd say is not just to listen to the people who report to you. I found that there are people who will tell you what you want to hear. And sometimes, and I'm smiling as I say this, sometimes people will sow mischief just for the sake of sowing mischief. They'll tell you something to see how you're going to react to it. The old saying, why is politics so bad in the university? And it's because the stakes are so low. So, my reflection, get out of the office, talk to people, manage by walking around. The other is to enjoy the journey. You have to be able to smile at what you're doing. You have to be able to enjoy it, because you're selling. You're always selling the vision. You're selling the change you're trying to see in the university ahead of you. And if you go down, if you're walking around in the dumps, grumpy, not convinced that things are going well, people read that. So you've got to be optimistic. Naturally optimistic is better. But there are challenges, and so often people want to talk to you about the challenges they face. They don't necessarily believe that you can solve that challenge for them, but they want to be listened to. So listening to people, trusting in people, respecting people, fundamental key learnings and reflections for me.
So, Mike, you spoke about some of the things that sort of helped and supported you internally in terms of that change. I'm just wondering if there was any sort of communities externally which helped with this process.
Yes. One of the things that I've tried to say a couple of times today is this, for me, always important point of trying to stay connected with external partners and universities to understand what they're doing to be able to take learnings in, but also, I haven't used this word, but to kind of benchmark what we were doing, the good and the not so good. And SEFI played a key role in that. Having a community that I could engage with, that I could bounce ideas off, that I could simply just listen to what fellow deans were doing, really was quite important. It provides an outlet at one level, but it also provides a kind of an empathetic sounding board for what you're trying to do as well. And it's simply also a way to get out of the office, get some perspective on what you're trying to do. So, Neil, you talked about at the very opening, this is a time of change within higher education, with restructurings and mergers all over Europe and the world. So there are lots of people that are going through the types of evolutions that I faced, that DIT faced, etc. So having the opportunity to engage with people like that is really helpful. And then, as I said, as I tried to ensure that SEFI was, if you like, an entry point for more and more of our academic staff to have a window on the wider world and what European universities were doing, SEFI became important that way as well. So I really do think for its faults, and perhaps it's, it could be perhaps stronger in some areas, but SEFI is a wonderful opportunity that each of us needs to take advantage of and derive the benefits that we want out of an organization like SEFI. And I think just as a collaborating opportunity for people, it's brilliant.
So, Mike, thank you so much for joining us today on this special episode of our podcast to coincide with the SEFI 2023 conference in TU Dublin. So for our listeners who are interested in driving change and transformation within their own context, be them deans, lecturers or researchers, what final piece of advice can you offer?
Neil, before commencing any initiative, and that could be an initiative at the dean level, at, say, a program chair level, it could be even an initiative that a head of department or head of school has tasked you with. Before commencing that initiative, you have to have a clear idea of what you want to achieve. And you also have to have the ability to know when that has actually been achieved. In other words, when are you finished? So that is first and foremost, clear idea of what you want to achieve, knowing when it's going to be done, and then trying to determine whether you have the wherewithal within the resources, the team that you have, if it's yourself, whether you can affect that change yourself, or whether in fact there are resources that you're going to need to bring in. I would say for larger initiatives, don't be afraid to bring in external support. Now, you have to be careful about that. External support can give you the types of, for example, expertise associated with, we talked about Cotter, the 8-change model. So processes associated with change can very often be brought in from the outside. But in an academic environment, you need to be very careful, because academics know better than anybody else, right? So sometimes external support for you may not be accepted in the type of change initiative that you might be trying to engage. Then you've got to work really hard on internal support for the change initiative. When I reorganized the Joint Faculty of Engineering and Built Environment, I had most of the heads of school with me on the journey, but not all. But I also had failed to do some of that other stakeholdering with my peers, fellow deans, and the president in terms of where we were on that journey. So that surprised me later on when we came to implement. There is an old saying as well that organizing a university or faculty or a school is like organizing a cemetery. You cannot expect any help from the occupants. But I would say that's not true. In initiative after initiative, I would say the rule of thirds apply. If you have a clear vision for what you're trying to achieve and you can describe it and explain it, you're going to have approximately a third of the people with you to begin with. Approximately a third of the people will never be with you. Don't waste your time with them. Right. And a third of the people essentially still remain to be convinced. And those are the third of the people that you work on.
Yeah.
So I have to say that if you're open and transparent with people, you explain things, you listen, then generally speaking, people will give you a fair hearing. So that's kind of my final words would be, have a vision for what you want to achieve, sell the vision up, down, and across the university, and keep selling it. And then in terms of how you engage with people, to trust, respect, and listen to them, and to be brave. Go for it.
Mike, thank you so much for joining us today.
Neil, Natalie, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
So Natalie, that was a bit of a departure from our normal episode, sort of interviewing a past president of SEFI and dean. We framed it as a story of transformation, but really I think it was just as much about listening to someone with great leadership and people skills. And Mike's work at TUD, developing this research capability by bringing in Fulbright scholars like Shannon Chance, has had and is still having a real impact in the field. So what were your takeaways?
So yeah, I really agree with you, Neil. It was a really interesting conversation, and a few sort of things stood out for me, really. I think Mike's focus on external sort of networks and collaborators was, really reminded me of the benefits of that. And I guess as well, I was especially interested by him sort of commenting on how that changed as he developed through his career. Okay. Like as a sort of early career academic myself, I know I really value these external communities, but I never really thought about what they bring to people who are at that sort of dean level as well, who go through the maybe the bigger challenges and changes in the landscape and have to deal with that, and how that community can support in that kind of work. I think the other sort of thing that I've taken away is just the value of talking to people, listening, those trust elements that Mike spoke about, and being, genuine and true to yourself. I think that's, in terms of leadership, that's a good piece of advice. So I think they're my main takeaways, really. I mentioned at the start of the episode that I knew I needed to be a bit more strategic, and I certainly think that Mike alluded to some of the ways he was quite strategic. So, focusing on sort of government policy and what was going on externally in terms of accreditation, in terms of Engineers Island, in terms of sort of the knowledge sector. So yeah, I think thinking about some of those things and how they align, and just, having some patience and just waiting for things to happen as well. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, similar to what you said, a lot of the episode was, I think, about people and and valuing people. Now, Mike was the president of SEFI when I joined its board, and I always felt sort of very fortunate to have worked with him during that time. Sort of his skills in sort of bringing people on board, making them feel valued, pushing things on, making strategic changes at SEFI. I've witnessed this firsthand. He's a very inspiring person to work with, and I hope listeners got some measure of that.
So if it's the first time you've listened to the SEFI podcast, remember to subscribe. It can help other people to find the podcast. Also remember that you can access on YouTube and the show notes, which are on the SEFI website.